Namaskara, Michael.
Namaskaram.
Welcome again. I'm so happy that you are with us to have this eighth and final talk about eight key points about Bhagavan's teachings. You wrote about those eight key points in an introduction you wrote for a book that I compiled based on your translations and explanations of Uḻḷadu Nāṛpadu, 41st on What Is.
Yes.
And if anyone wants to read that awesome introduction, they can find it on your website. I think if I have the date correct, it was the 19th of September in 1924. Well, it was at least in September. So there, the
Yes.
people can read the whole introduction and also the eight key points. So again, today, the final key point, the eighth one, and before I'm gonna read that one so that everyone understands what we're talking about, I wanted to read the sixth and the seventh ones, and I'm going to share my screen so that everyone can read along. Let me quickly see. Sixth key point that we talked about. Each key point has its own video. It's on a playlist on the Sri Ramana Teachings channel. And the sixth key point we talked about is everything other than our own being. I am is just an illusory appearance that seems to exist only in the view of ourself as ego. So all such things seem to exist only when we rise and stand as ego, and hence none of them exist at all when we do not rise as ego. The seventh key point, which was the previous meeting, was about our rising as ego is therefore the root cause for the appearance of all other things, including all problems and all forms of suffering. And today we're going to talk about the eighth key point, and afterwards we're going to answer questions that were asked. The eighth key point is, and finally, since ego will cease to exist only when we investigate ourselves keenly enough, investigating ourselves is the only means by which we can permanently put an end to the illusory appearance of all other things and thereby free ourselves forever from all forms of suffering. So that's the key point for today. And if you want to talk about that, that would be awesome.
Right. Okay. Firstly, since ego will cease to exist only when we investigate ourselves keenly enough, this is very clearly implied by Bhagavan in Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, particularly in verses. Second, I'll just open it. I think 22 and 27, which interestingly enough are the verse before and the verse after a series of verses where Bhagavan explains the nature of ego. So what he says in verse 22, it's more implicit. In verse 27, it's more explicit. What he says in verse 22 is, except by turning the mind back within, completely immersing it in God, who shines within that mind, giving light to the mind, how to fathom God by the mind, consider. When Bhagavan talks here, the word he uses for God is pati, which means the Lord. So in this context, the Lord or God is referring to what is shining in our mind, giving light to the mind. What shines in the mind, giving light to the mind, is the pure awareness I am. So that is the God Bhagavan is talking about here. He's not talking about any external form of God. He's talking about God as he really is, which is pure being and pure awareness, Satchit. And that is what shines within each one of us as our own being, as that fundamental awareness I am. So what he says in this verse is, well, this verse is a rhetorical question, but the implication of the rhetorical question is that it is not possible to fathom God by the mind. That in other words, it's not possible for us to know God as he actually is, except by turning the mind back within and completely immersing it in him. That is, completely immersing it in that light of pure awareness, which is ever shining within us as our own being, I am. And that is the light that illumines the mind. Illumines means makes the mind aware, and thereby enabling the mind to be aware of things other than of both itself and things other than itself. So the mind here refers to the knowing element of the mind, that is ego. So we have to turn this knowing element of the mind, namely ego, back within. In other words, we have to turn our entire attention back within. Turning back within means turning the attention back within. So the attention is ego's attention. So we as ego need to turn our attention back within. Back within means back towards ourselves, to face ourselves alone. Everything other than ourselves is external to ourselves. So turning back within, in the deepest sense that Bhagavan uses it here and elsewhere, means turning our attention back to ourselves alone. All thoughts, feelings, and so on, though relatively speaking, we can say they're within the mind, that is within and without a relative terms. So in this context, even the thoughts, the feelings, everything other than our own being is external to ourselves. So turning the mind back within means turning our attention back towards ourselves, and thereby immersing ourselves in God. Immersing means drowning in him, losing ourselves in him. So we cannot know him as he is so long as we remain separate from him. We cannot know God as an object because he is not an object. He is the reality of the subject. So we can know him only by being him. God is pure awareness. Pure awareness can never be an object of awareness. So we can know pure awareness only by being pure awareness. And how we can... Pure awareness is what we always actually are, but we seem to be something other than pure awareness when we rise as ego. So the means to put an end to the rising of ego is to turn the mind back within, to face itself, its own being, and thereby, by turning our attention back towards ourselves, we thereby subside. And if we turn our attention towards ourselves keenly enough, we will subside completely and thereby dissolve in God, in our own being, that is. And dissolving in that means being that. So it's only by being what we actually are that we can know what we actually are. Or in other words, it's only by being God that we can know God. So this is the implication of this verse. So the clear implication here is that the only means to know God or ourself as we actually are is by turning our attention back within. In the previous verse, he had said, the previous verse was, that's verse 21. Actually, no, first I'll read verse 20 and 21 because these that is, these two verses connect with verse 22. In verse 21, what he says is, leaving oneself who sees, oneself seeing God is seeing a mental vision. When he says leaving oneself, it means the implication is without seeing oneself, if one sees God, one's seeing God as an object, and seeing God as an object is just seeing a mental vision, because all objects, all phenomena, all forms are mental creations. So if we see God in form, if we see God as something other than ourselves, we are just seeing a mental vision. We are not seeing God as he actually is. And then the next sentence, Bhagavan has Bhagavan has packed a lot into this sentence. The literal meaning of the sentence is, but it needs a little bit of deciphering. Only one who sees oneself, the origin of oneself, is one who has seen God, because the origin, oneself, going, oneself is not other than God. Here he's using the Tamil word tan and its various forms. The Tamil word tan means oneself, but he's using this word to refer to, in some places he's referring to ego, in some places he's referring to what we actually are. So when he says only one who sees oneself, the origin of oneself, what he means is only one who sees one's own reality, what one actually is, which is the origin of oneself as ego, is one who has seen God. So the implication is God is what we actually are. So only by seeing ourselves as we actually are we seeing God as we actually are. What we actually are is the origin of ourself as ego. And then in the next clause he says, because the origin oneself going, here he's using the word in the previous clause he was using the word origin to refer to ourself as we actually are, which is the origin of ourself as ego. Here, when he uses origin the second time, he's using it to refer to ego, which is the origin of everything else. That is, what we actually are, Atma-swarupa, is the origin of ego. Ego, in turn, is the origin of everything else, because everything else exists only in the view of ego. So when he says, because the origin oneself, he's that is oneself is in opposition to origin, there he's referring to ego. So because oneself, the origin, oneself going, that means when ego, only when ego goes, we are nothing other than God. What makes us seem to be separate from God is our rising as ego. When we get rid of ego by seeing ourselves as we actually are, we will see that we are nothing other than God. And then that's verse 20. That's verse 20. And yes, then in verse 21 he asks, he says, if one asks what is the truth of many texts that say oneself seeing oneself, seeing God, that means oneself seeing oneself and seeing God. These are two things many Vedantic texts talk about: oneself seeing oneself and seeing God. So what is the truth of the texts that talk of these, of oneself seeing oneself and seeing God? The reply is it's not there, it's implied. He then asks a rhetorical question. Since oneself is one, how is oneself to see oneself? That is, we cannot see ourselves as an object because we are one. So when he says, since oneself is one, how is oneself to see oneself? The implication is we cannot see ourselves as an object. We can see ourselves only by being ourselves. That is, but if we remain as we actually are, that is knowing ourselves. When we rise as ego, we know ourselves, but not as we actually are. We know ourselves as something else. That is, as ego, we know ourselves as I am this body, which is not what we actually are. So to know ourselves as we actually are, we need to be what we actually are. In other words, we need to cease rising as ego. And so in this sentence he says, since oneself is one, how is oneself to see oneself? If it is not possible to see, that implies if it's not possible for oneself to see oneself, how to see God? That's the question. Then the answer he gives is Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, which literally means becoming food is seeing. What he means by becoming food is only when we lose ourselves completely in God and thereby remain, that is, when we dissolve completely in God, God being what we actually are, that alone is seeing him. So only when becoming food means only by the dissolution of ego in God are we truly seeing God. Because by losing ourselves in him, we remain as him. And since he's pure awareness, he always knows himself as he actually is. So this verse 22, which I explained first, is a continuation of this. So what he talks about in verse 22 is completely immersing in God. That is what he meant in the previous verse by becoming food. So only when we lose ourselves completely in God, when we as ego dissolve in him, are we truly seeing him. And here God refers to ourself as we actually are, because God is not something other than ourself. He seems to be other than ourself because we've risen as ego. So long as we rise as ego, we limit ourselves as if we were this small person. As this person, obviously we are not, that is, we do not know ourselves as God. We know ourselves as this person. In order to know ourselves as God, that is, as we actually are, we need to give up this ego, the false awareness, I am this body. So when he says in this verse 22, except by turning the mind back within, that clearly implies except by self-investigation, except by attending to what we actually are. That's the only way that we can know God as he actually is. So this clearly implies self-investigation is the only means to know God. And we can know God as he actually is only by becoming food to him. In other words, by the dissolution of ego. So here the implication is clear, but we need to read it and think about it very carefully in order to see that is the clear implication. The next verse in which he wait a second, I'll just get that verse 20. Then he, after 22, whereas 23, 24, 25, and 26, he's talking about the nature of ego, and including how everything else is just arises from ego. That is, it's only in the view of ego that other things seem to exist. So that's all explained very thoroughly in 23, 24, 25, and 26. And then in verse 27, this is the verse where he makes it most explicit that the only way to annihilate ego is by investigating ourselves. That is, what he says in this verse is, the state in which I is without rising is the state in which we are as that. Without investigating the place where I rises, how to reach the annihilation of oneself in which I does not rise. Without reaching, how to stand in one's own state in which oneself is that, say. That's the literal meaning of the verse, but it requires a little bit of explanation. When he says the state in which I is without rising, that is the state of just being without rising as ego. So if we remain as we actually are without rising as ego, that is, we always are what we actually are, but we seem to be something other than what we actually are when we rise as ego, because as ego we're always aware of ourselves as I am this body. So in order to know ourselves as we actually are, we need to be without rising, implying without rising as ego. And that state in which we are just being without rising, that is the state in which we are as that. That here refers to Brahman. So in the Upanishads, it is taught that Tattvamasi, you are that. Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman. So what we actually are is Brahman. But in order to experience ourselves as such, we need to remain without rising as ego. We need to be without rising as ego. That state in which we are just being without rising as ego is the state in which we are as that. That means that implies the state in which we experience ourselves as that. We are always that. We are always Brahman, but we don't experience ourselves as such now because we've risen as ego. So in order to experience ourselves as Brahman, we need to be without rising. So that's the first sentence. Then the second sentence is a rhetorical question. Without investigating the place where I rises, how to reach the annihilation of oneself in which I does not rise. That is, here he clarifies firstly that what he means by the state in which I is without rising is the state in which ego is annihilated. What he refers to as the annihilation of oneself implies the annihilation of ego. So only when ego is annihilated do we remain permanently, eternally, without rising. So how to reach that state without investigating the place where I rises? When he says investigating the place where I rises, he's using the word place. In Tamil, it's tanam. Tanam is a Tamil form of the Sanskrit word sthana, which literally means place, but it implies the source, the place where I rises. It's not a place in space. It's a metaphorical place. That is from where does ego rise? Ego rises only from our being. So the place where I rises is our being. So what he implies in this sentence is, without investigating our being from which we have risen as ego, how to reach the annihilation of ourself as ego, which is the state in which I does not rise. So this is a rhetorical question, but the clear implication is, but we cannot reach the annihilation of ourselves. In other words, we cannot attain the eradication of ego without investigating the place from where we have risen. The place from where we have risen is our own being. So without investigating our own being, it is not possible to annihilate ourselves. That is the clear implication of this rhetorical question. And then he asks another rhetorical question, without reaching, implying without reaching the annihilation of ourselves. In other words, without being annihilated, how to stand in one's own state in which oneself is that. So how to be as we actually are without annihilating ego, and how to annihilate ego without investigating the place where I rises. So this verse, though he expresses in the form of rhetorical question, the implication of these rhetorical questions is very clear. But the only way to annihilate ego is to investigate ourselves. The reason for this is very simple. Ego is a false awareness of ourself. That is, as ego, we're always aware of ourselves as, I am this body, I am this person. So we are aware of ourselves as something other than what we actually are. So we cannot get rid of this false awareness without being aware of ourselves as we actually are. So in order to be aware of ourselves as we actually are, we need to know what we actually are. And in order to know what we actually are, we need to investigate ourselves. Investigate ourselves means we need to attend to ourselves. We need to focus our entire attention on ourselves. This is the only means by which we can become aware of ourselves as we actually are and thereby annihilate ego. So long as we're aware of anything other than ourselves, that which is aware of those other things is not ourself as we actually are, because what we actually are is pure awareness, which is not aware of anything other than itself. It's only as ego that we are aware of things other than ourselves. So long as we are aware of anything other than ourselves, we we have that's a clear indication that we've risen as ego and are experiencing ourselves as I am this body. That is, we have risen as ego and are consequently experiencing ourselves as I am this body. So in order to get rid of this false awareness, we need to cease being aware of anything else. But merely cease being aware of anything else is not sufficient, because every night when we fall asleep, we cease being aware of anything else. We withdraw our attention from all other things and we subside in sleep. But ego is not thereby annihilated, because in order to annihilate ego, because ego is a false awareness, we as ego must experience ourselves as we actually are. Ego can never actually experience itself as it actually is, but as soon as we experience ourselves as such, that is, as soon as we experience ourselves as we actually are, we thereby cease to be ego and remain as we actually are. So it's only by attending to ourselves but we can see ourselves as we actually are. So that's my initial introduction to this subject. Do you want to ask any questions about this, or?
Yeah, I do want to ask some questions about it. By the way, while I was preparing this topic, I also thought that verse 30 was very beautiful.
Verse 30, yes, that's also very important. But the reason I chose these two verses in particular was because they clearly imply that it's only that there's no way other than self-investigation.
Yeah.
Verse 30, of course, is also very relevant.
Yeah, maybe I shall read it quickly for if people are thinking verse 30. It is as soon as the mind reaches the heart inwardly, investigating who am I, when he who is I dies, which is ego, one thing appears spontaneously as I am I. Though it appears, it is not I. It is the whole, the substance that is oneself. Yeah. One of the questions that I sometimes have is I think I have a good understanding what is meant with self-investigation. Bhagavan says in Nanyar is always Atma-vichara is always keeping the mind on oneself, and another word of calling it is self-attention or self-attentiveness, and putting that into practice. I'm aware that it's, of course, I mean, that what we actually are doesn't have the need for any practice. So it's ego who's doing the practice. So ego is investigating itself, is being self-attentive. And I was wondering, is there a difference between self-attention and self-abidance?
No. As Bhagavan says in verse 26 of Upadesha, knowing oneself is being oneself. Sorry, I put that wrong way around. Being oneself alone is knowing oneself. So
Okay.
we can never know ourselves as an object. As he says in verse 21, which I read earlier, since oneself is one, how is oneself to see oneself? So we can never see ourselves as an object. He says the same in verse, verse 33. Saying I do not know myself or I have known myself is ground for ridicule. That they're both ground for ridicule. Why? Then he says, to make oneself an object are there two selves. So it's not one self knowing another self. So we can know ourselves only by being ourselves. So why does he say it's ridiculous to say, I do not know myself? Because we always know ourselves. The problem is that though we know ourselves, as ego, we know ourselves as this body, which is not what we actually are. And to say, I have known myself, that implies that there's a separate I to say, I have known myself. When we know ourselves, that is the dissolution of ego. So then there's then no separate I to say, I have known myself. What knows itself as it actually is pure awareness, which is always knows itself as it actually is. So the one who now seeks to know ourselves as we actually are, our ego, when we know ourselves as we actually are, we will cease to be ego and remain as we actually are. So when we remain as we actually are, we will know that we have always known ourselves as we actually are. So what we actually are does not need to rise to say, I have known myself. So Bhagavan says, saying either I know myself or I do not know myself, both are ground for ridicule, because they're not two selves for one self to be an object of the other self. As he says, being one is the truth, the experience of everyone. That's how he concludes the verse. So we all experience ourselves as one. So knowing ourselves is just being ourselves. Being ourselves alone is knowing ourselves. The more and that, so self-abidance is the same as self-attention. We have to infer from that. We can also explain it in another way. As Bhagavan explains in verse 25 of Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, this is not what the exact words he says there, but what he clearly implies there is that we cannot rise, stand, or flourish as ego without grasping form. What he means by grasping form, that in the same verse he describes ego as Uruvatra Peyahande. That means formless demon ego. Since ego is formless, that means it has no form of its own. So any form is something other than ourselves. So as soon as we rise as ego, we project a form and identify that form as I. So the first form we experience is the form of this body, which we experience as I. So he says there, grasping form, it comes into being. Grasping form, it stands. It stands means it endures, it continues. And then he says, grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. So as soon as that is, rising as ego entails projecting and identifying a body as I. So the rising of ourself as ego and experiencing ourselves as this body are simultaneous. And we continue to experience ourselves as this body so long as we stand as ego. In other words, so long as we endure or continue as ego, we always experience ourselves as I in this body. That's the implication of the first. So in the first two sentences, the form he's referring to is the form of the body. But having identified ourselves with this form of this body, we are then constantly attending to other forms. Forms means phenomena of any kind whatsoever, whether physical phenomena or mental phenomena. So when he says grasping and feeding on forms, it flourishes abundantly. What he implies is attention to forms, attention to things other than ourselves, is the food on which we live as ego. So we cannot rise, stand, or flourish as ego without constantly grasping form. That means without constantly attending to things other than ourselves. But so the very nature of ego is to always attend to things other than itself. But if we as ego try to attend to ourselves, what we actually are is formless. So by attending to ourselves, in other words, by trying to grasp ourselves, we thereby, to the extent to which we attend to ourselves, we thereby let go of other things. So we are no longer holding, if we are holding on, if we are keenly self-attentive, we are holding on to ourselves and thereby letting go of other things. So to the extent to which we attend to ourselves, we as ego thereby subside. That's why he says in the same verse, Tedinal otum pidicum. That means if seeking, it takes flight. If seeking implies, if ego seeks to know itself, if it seeks to know who am I, it will thereby take flight means it'll run away. That's a metaphorical way of saying it will subside and eventually it will dissolve back into its source. So since the nature of ego is to rise, stand, and flourish by attending to other things, but to subside by attending to itself, the only way in which we can subside and be as we actually are is by self-attentiveness. So to the extent to which we are self-attentive, we thereby subside. To the extent to which we subside, we come close to being as we actually are. Being as we actually are is what is called self-abidance. So yes, to the extent to which we are self-attentive, to that extent we are being as we actually are. We are abiding as ourself.
Yeah, I can understand from the way how you explain it that they are the same.
Yes.
For me in my practice, when my mind is sometimes very much turned outwards, like it's being hypnotized with whatever it's hypnotized by, but then there's a moment of clarity, and then it helps to ask to whom, who's the one who's thinking this or whatever.
Yeah.
And that feels for me that I would translate it as self-investigation. I'm investigating to whom whatever experience appears. And then immediately I'm aware of the sense of beingness that is always present. Right. And that I would then translate as self-abidance.
Yeah, exactly. Another thing that is, nobody has ever seen ego. We cannot see ego. We seem to be ego so long as we're looking at other things. But if we look at ourselves, in other words, if we attend to ourselves, there's no such thing as ego to be found. That's what he says in verse 17 of Upadesha. There he uses the word mind, but he's referring to, what he refers to as mind there is ego. Because ego is the knowing element of the mind. It's the root of the mind, as he explains in the next verse, verse 18 of Upadesha. So what he says in verse 17 is, Manitin uruve maravadu chava manamena mondrile undipara. That means when one investigates the form of the mind without forgetting, there's no such thing as mind. So we seem to be mind or ego so long as we're looking at other things. But when we look at ourselves, there's no such thing as mind or ego to be found. The only thing that we actually find is pure being awareness, Satchit. So to the extent to which we attend to ourselves, we see ourselves as mere being.
Yeah.
And seeing ourselves as mere being is the subsidence of ego.
Yeah.
So basically, self-attentiveness is the chit aspect. Self-abidance is the sat aspect. Sat is chit and chit is sat. They're one and the same. Being is awareness. Awareness is being. Awareness is what we actually are.
Yeah. And I thought a lot about, of course, that verse where it says, if seeking, it takes flight. It's very interesting to be aware of how quickly let's keep things to myself. I am conceptualizing things that I read, of course, because you kind of try to understand.
Yeah.
But I guess the thing that I'm doing, or anyone who practices this in this way, like the mind goes outwards and then suddenly, to whom is this appearing or happening or whatever, and then the mind turns inwards. You're aware suddenly of your beingness. I guess I can translate that as it takes flight, because suddenly, it's simple as that. Because I think a lot of people, it seems like ego is some kind of existing entity. Now, of course, it's written as ghost or demon or phantom. But I'm also aware in my practice how much, even in the practice, there's I tend to give reality to ego as if it is something real. And recently something happened, and I also wanted to ask it as a question. I was listening to something you were saying on a video, and that in itself was already, I don't know exactly what you were talking about, but it was about the reality and the unreality of ego, and that ego was, I have to paraphrase this, but I think you said it as the failing in ignorance, the failing of ignorance, you
Yeah.
said. And that was like, yes, I thought it was very beautiful what you said.
Yeah.
Yes, I thought that's exactly what is happening. But then I had a kind of an aha moment because I thought, wait a minute, if I give reality to this, I'm giving reality to ego.
Yes.
And then I became aware of that thought. And suddenly I thought, if I keep on thinking like this, I'm in a loop.
Yeah.
Do you understand what I'm trying to
I
say?
understand what you say. Yeah, it's very easy to get caught to um, that is because our whole experience is centered around ego. All our experience of multiplicity, the core of the experience of multiplicity is the experiencer, which is ego. So by experiencing anything other than ourselves, we are giving reality to ego. And but if we want to dissolve that seeming reality of ego, the only way is to look at ourselves.
Yeah.
Because if we look at ourselves, there's no such thing as ego to be found.
No,
So
because sorry, yeah?
so ego both exists and doesn't exist. That is, it doesn't exist as ego, but underlying ego is the one real existence, the pure being that we actually are. So we can't say of ego either that it is or it is not. That is, it is not as ego, but it is as Satchit.
Yeah, in that moment, I was aware it was very, very subtle.
Mm,
And so in the beginning, I gave reality to kind of acknowledgement of, yeah, the failing of ignorance, what
yeah,
happened, which is ego, what happens by ego, it's the same for me. And so I felt kind of acknowledged for what I seemingly
yeah,
continuously experience.
yeah,
But then there was that aha moment. Wait a minute, here I'm giving reality to something that is not real but seems to be real.
yeah,
So it's like that is in itself also part of ego's
yeah,
trick.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
It's like illusion giving reality to illusion. So,
This
and that is
this
what I call the
this
loop.
is this is Maya.
Yeah.
This is
Well,
Maya.
that was exactly the word that I
And
that I thought.
there's no such thing as Maya other than ego.
Yeah.
Ego itself is Maya.
Yeah, so that was that was a very interesting moment.
Yeah, yeah,
And of course, the quickest way and the simplest way to snap out of it is to whom are these thoughts, and or not even ask it, and
yes,
immediately put the attention back just on being aware of beingness. But I was very much aware in that moment, with good intentions, but I guess that's all a matter of practice, how easily this can happen while you're having this kind of discussions with yourself, and you're keep staying into that loop of ego. And I guess the quickest way to get out of that is to whom is
yeah,
even to whom is all these thoughts or
yeah,
whatever. Yeah. But in that moment, I could feel if I stay in this, you're kind of checkmate because it seems as if you can't get out of it.
yeah.
But you can get out of it because you just have to ask to whom.
But not even ask to whom. You need to see to whom.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
You need to
yeah,
turn
that's
your
true.
attention back within.
Yeah, but and that led me to the following question. Is well, it's a sincere question. Maybe it's part of Maya. Is can ego be aware of its own ignorance or failing, or is it the clarity of that of your real nature?
That is, ego's ignorance is not anything other than ego. Ego itself is ignorance. That is, when we talk of ignorance, the ignorance is the false awareness I am this body. So yes, we are aware of our ignorance, but we are not aware of it as ignorance. To us, it appears to be knowledge. It appears to us to be real, but we have this body. So what is actually false appears as real. So what is actually ignorance appears to us as knowledge. Yes, I know I'm this body. It's my experience I'm this body.
Yes. I'm trying to listen to what you're saying, because
Yeah,
there seems to be at moments like the clarity of that I'm caught up in ignorance,
yeah, yes,
like kind of that viveka that I had in
yeah,
that moment, like, wait a minute,
mm,
this is still ego, and affirming that it's veiling the experience.
yeah,
So there is a moment of clarity there, and from that clarity, the question arose: can ego be aware of its own veiling or ignorance? And if I think about it myself deeply or logically, then the answer seems to be no, because its nature is ignorance. So how can it
yeah,
ever have that
yes,
clarity?
yeah. It can never know it as ignorance,
Yeah.
because what is ignorance, it knows as knowledge.
But can I then conclude that the clarity that arises is Bhagavan's grace or nothing other
Yeah,
than
yeah,
our
it
true
is.
nature?
It's
Okay.
about, yeah, yeah. Talking about ego and ignorance, another point came to my mind now. That if you listen to anyone who has been trained in classical Advaita, one thing you'll often hear them say is that error can arise only out of ignorance. They give the example, only because you don't know that what's lying on the ground is a rope, first there's the ignorance, and then because of the ignorance, you can superimpose an error on it. So because you don't know that it's a rope, you can mistake it to be a snake. If you know it's a rope, then you can't mistake it to be a snake. So they say there are two things: there's ignorance and there's error. This is if we use analogies, this seems plausible, but actually it is not so. The error and the ignorance are one and the same thing. There is no such thing as ignorance other than the false awareness, I am this body. The false awareness, I am this body, is the error, but it's also the ignorance. They're not two different things. But then the way the way people are trained in classical Advaita, first there's ignorance, and because of the ignorance, then we make the error of taking ourselves to be the body, as if there's some it's giving a reality to ignorance, as if there's some ignorance independent of the false awareness I am this body. But Bhagavan made it very clear that ignorance and the error are nothing other than ego, which is the false awareness I am this body. So this false awareness I am this body is both the ignorance and the error. There's no separate error other than this, sorry, there's no separate ignorance other than this error of mistaking ourselves to be this body. Because this is the problem sometimes when things are analyzed too much and explained too much, analogies are used, and then people draw the wrong inference from the analogy. So if you take the analogy of the snake or the rope or any other case, you can make an error about something only if you don't know what it is. That's fine about objective things, but as far as we are concerned, the ignorance and the error are one and the same thing. Both are only ego. There is neither any ignorance nor any error other than ego.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I what I explained earlier, I was explaining the first part of the passage we're dealing with. Wait a second, I've got to find it again. Yeah, since ego will cease to exist only when we investigate ourselves keenly enough. I've explained that. I mean,
Yeah.
but not maybe not. Well, I have explained to some extent, but I've also pointed out where Bhagavan clearly implies that in Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu. But the other part, the main part of the sentence is, since that is the case, investigating ourselves is the only means by which we can permanently put an end to the illusory appearance of all other things and thereby free ourselves forever from all forms of suffering. So this also I need to explain. That is, it's only when we rise as ego that we're aware of anything other than ourselves. So without ego, there's nothing else exists. There is no suffering. In sleep, for example, when we don't rise as ego, we are completely free of suffering. However much we may be suffering in the waking or dream states, when we're actually asleep, that means when we're in deep sleep, there is no suffering at all because there's no ego. That is, what suffers is ego. So the only way to put an end to all suffering is to cease rising as ego. The only way to put an end to the rising of ego permanently is to investigate ourselves. That's why Bhagavan, in the first sentence, well, the very first clause of Nāna, he begins by saying, Sakala Jivagalam Dukkam Envadindri Epodum Sukhamayiraka Virumbadalam. Since all sentient beings like or love or want to be always happy without what is called misery. Why does Bhagavan include here Dukkam Envadindri without what is called misery? Wouldn't it have been just sufficient if he had said, since all beings like to be always happy? Yes, if we say that covers the whole idea. But to emphasize the point, that is, of course, if we're happy, we're free of misery. If we're truly happy, we're free of misery. But to emphasize the fact, in order for us to be happy, we need to be free of misery. And he adds such things there to make us think more deeply. I mean, we need to, when we read such passages, we need to ask ourselves, why doesn't he simply say, since all beings like to be happy? That itself implies we like to be without misery. But he added without misery because happiness is our real nature. The truth is we are always happy, but we seem to be not happy because we're suffering. And we're suffering because we do not know ourselves as we actually are. When we rise as ego, the very nature of ego is suffering. That is, the word sukham and dukkam, we usually translate as happiness and unhappiness, or happiness and misery, or whatever. But another way of translating them, sukham means satisfaction. Dukkam means dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction is the very nature of ego. He says the same in the 14th paragraph. He says, towards the end of the towards the end of the 14th paragraph, he says, Jagam Embadu Nineve. What is called the world is only thought. Jagam Mariam Podu Adavadu Ninevatra Podum Manam Anandate Anubhavikindradu. When the world disappears, that is, when thought is absent, the mind experiences happiness. Jagam Tondram Podu, when the world appears, Adu Dukkate Anubhavikindradu, we experience misery. So well, here he's talking about the world, but he also makes it clear elsewhere, because the world is only thought, so there's no world other than thought. The first of all thoughts, as he explains in the 5th paragraph, is the thought called I, namely ego. So without ego, there's no world, there's no thought, and without thought, there's no world. So the implication is that dukkam, misery or dissatisfaction, is the very nature of ego. Because he says when the world appears, the mind experiences dukkam, it experiences misery or dissatisfaction. The world appears whenever we rise as ego. So the very nature of ego is dukkam. We can understand from that. That's why Bhagavan in the first clause, and that first clause is not, sorry, the first paragraph was not part of the answers that he gave to Shiv Prakasham Pillai. He wrote that paragraph only when he rewrote the questions and answers in the form of an essay. So it's only for the essay version that he added that. Later they added that as an introductory paragraph to a later modified form of the earlier question and answer version, but it was for the essay version. Bhagavan wrote that, so that is something he wrote entirely of his own accord. So that first paragraph is extremely important. So he emphasizes not only we want to be happy, we want to be happy without what is called misery. What is called misery boils down to nothing but ego. Which is why when I wrote this this 8th point, where is it? I said, since ego will cease to exist only when we investigate ourselves keenly enough, investigating ourselves is the only means by which we can permanently put an end to the illusory appearance of all other things and thereby free ourselves forever from all forms of suffering. All forms of suffering, the essence of all forms of suffering is ego. Suffering exists only for ego. Suffering is the very nature of ego. So we may say, oh, I'm happy, I've got a pleasant life, I'm fairly contented. But deep down, none of us are satisfied. We always, whatever we have, there's every movement of the mind, every rising within us is driven by nothing but this deep dissatisfaction, which drives us to seek the infinite satisfaction or happiness, sukham, that we actually are. So all these, if we think about Bhagavan's teachings deeply enough, there's so many connections between all these different passages. That's one reason why I strongly recommend, rather than reading other books, focus on Bhagavan's original writings, because his teachings will become much clearer to us if we are familiar with all his original writings, which is not a lot. There's the 20 paragraphs of the essay version of Nana, the version that Bhagavan himself wrote, plus about 250 to 300 verses, of which 108 are Aksharamlai, which are just actually one-line verses, but they're printed in 2 lines because they're long lines. So the volume of Bhagavan's writings is very, very small. If we focus on that and have that always soaking in our mind, we'll see so many connections, and we'll see how coherent and how well all his teachings are tied together. What a coherent and consistent teaching it is that he has given us. And it's all that the heart of his teachings, that all his teachings, what they're pointing to, is what he says in that first paragraph of Nana. In order to experience that happiness, which is one's own real nature, which one experiences daily in sleep, it's necessary for oneself to know oneself. For that, the awareness investigation, Atma-vichara, who am I, is the principal means. So it's all that is the very heart of Bhagavan's teachings, is this need for us to investigate, who am I?
Yeah. I'm always touched if I, feel the deepness of, but in the meantime, in the same time, also the simpleness of the teaching.
Yes, 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 yes.
Yeah. And
it's so deep, but it's so simple.
And very, very, very beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
It's in that verse, or sorry, the 8 key points that you just read again, from what for me jumps out, because it's otherness or other things equals suffering. So
exactly,
that's duality.
Exactly. That's what he says in the 14th paragraph. When the world appears, the mind experiences misery, dissatisfaction, unhappiness.
Yeah. It's interesting to notice words can be like, how you say that, like anchors, or help you with clarity. And the world can sometimes seem a little bit like well, the world is kind of a lot, but also an abstract word. For me, it also helps, to think about otherness or dividance.
Yes. That's all the world is.
While our true nature is a non-dual and ejada. And I think, I guess, of course, that's the question in so many religions. Why is there suffering, and what is the cause of suffering? And
we
for
are
me,
the cause of suffering.
and for me, Bhagavan's teachings are are giving the answer, the answer
exactly.
to it. Yeah. I don't have any questions anymore about this, I think. But I'm also, by the way, aware that a lot of people are not able to understand the Bhagavan's explanation about the cause of suffering. And but there's also...
We just need to apply what he says to our experience, and we can see it clearly.
Yeah. Well, that's...
If anyone who has suffered in sleep, it's only in waking and dream that suffering occurs, because we've risen as ego.
Yeah. And by the way, I was doing this morning I have my usual morning reflections about Bhagavan's teachings. Usually I read a little bit. That always helps me. And I was thinking about the word happiness. And for some reason, the word safety was way... Well, you could equal it with happiness, of course. But I was aware of how important the word safety was for me, and why I like reading poems from Muruganar, where you read like seeking refuge at his feet.
There's only one place of safety, of refuge,
and I was so much
subsidence.
I was so much aware. I was so much aware. You can't find the everlasting safety in the world or in this body by having excellent health, because in the end it's mortal. It's a mortal experience being an ego. And there is no real ultimate safety to be found in duality.
No.
And it's not like reflecting on that for the first time, but it always helps to kind of reflect again on it, because it points the attention again to the only solution and truth and priority.
Exactly.
Okay. Sean, was there something you wanted to ask related to this?
Yes, I just had 2 points. Well, one question and 1 point. My first point was, wouldn't you say that seeing is being is knowing?
Yes.
Okay.
That is, seeing and knowing are synonymous in this context. And Bhagavan himself said in English, being is seeing. I think Murugan has quoted it in a footnote to his commentary on Aksharamla in some place, if I remember correctly.
My other question is, so you were just saying that you recommend Ramana's original writings. Is there anything else that you recommend, or is that it?
My point is, I recommend that above all else.
What else do you recommend?
Because, well, I recommend that because, I mean, there are other wonderful works like Guru Vasika Kovai. It's certainly worth reading Guru Vasika Kovai because it covers many. But if we read it carefully, everything that is said in Guru Vasika Kovai, it's implied somewhere in Bhagavan's original writings. That's why I recommend focusing on Bhagavan's original writings, because if we are familiar with his writings, like I several times a month, at least 5 times a month, there's a Zoom meeting in which people pose so many questions to me. People also pose questions to me by emails and other things, but I prefer if they do it by in these meetings. How is it so easy for me to answer all these questions? It's easy because my mind is soaked in Bhagavan's original works, and all the questions we ask, or all the useful questions that can be asked, are either explicitly or implicitly answered in Bhagavan's original writings. So to really understand Bhagavan's teachings, all we need is his own original writings. Everything else is just supplementary. Even Guru Vasika Kovai, I would say, it's just supplementary. The essence is there in Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, Upadesha Atma-vichara, Arunachala Panchakam, Nana, these few works.
Do you recommend your own commentaries, or do you think those don't reach the level of Bhagavan's work?
My commentaries are the outcome of my manana. So it may help, but ultimately, we each have to do manana for ourselves. So what explanations I've given may be helpful for as a catalyst to make people think. But I could write volumes and volumes of commentary, and they'd be useless if the people who read them don't do their own thinking. No one can do the manana for us.
I've personally become quite dependent on your thinking. I ask you questions all the time as I'm able to.
Yes, but we need to become self-reliant. One of the words in Sanskrit for a sage is muni. And the etymological derivation of muni comes from manana. Murugan says in his commentary on Aksharamla, his commentary on the Pairam, the introductory verse for Aksharamla that he wrote, Tarunaru Namani, there he refers to Bhagavan as Karuna Karamuni, Karuna Karamuni Ramana, Ramana, the embodiment of grace. The Muni Ramana, who is the embodiment of grace. He explains there, Muni means manana silam, one who is expert in manana. So much doing the manana is so important. Sravana is important. We need to pay close attention to what Bhagavan has taught us, but we also need to imbibe it. We need to make sense of it. That's why in Vivekachudamani, Shankara says something like 100 times more beneficial than Sravana is manana. And I can't remember the exact number he gives, 1,000 times or 100,000 times more effective than manana is nididhyasana. But that doesn't mean we can just do nididhyasana and ignore the other two, because the other two are the foundation. We need to have a solid foundation. If we don't have a deep and clear understanding of Bhagavan's teachings, we won't be able to put them into practice. So we need to do the Sravana. We need to pay close attention to what Bhagavan has taught us. We need to constantly be thinking about it to make sense of it. And then with the understanding born of that Sravana and Manana, we put it into practice. That doesn't mean we have to first do Sravana. Some people explain first you have to do Sravana, then you have to do Manana, then you have to do Nididhyasana. It's not like that. It's an iterative process. The deeper you go in the practice, the deeper will be your Sravana and Manana. The deeper your Sravana and Manana, the deeper you'll go in the practice. So it's a self-feeding loop.
Just out of curiosity,
These three, Sravana, Manana, and Nididhyasana, need to go on hand in hand throughout our life.
out of curiosity, like Sandra and I really like, I've mentioned before, Muruganar's books, translated by Robert Butler, Padmalai and Sri Guru Ramana Prasadam. Now, are those works that you recommend or not?
By all means, read all these things, but don't, the anchor, all these are peripheral. What is the heart of all these things is Bhagavan's own original writings.
Okay.
So as I say, everything else is supplementary. The essence is Bhagavan's own original writings.
And now for Sandra and I don't know if you would want to agree with this or not, but we believe that you have the best translations in English. Do you believe that to be the case? I know you believe you try to make them as accurate as possible.
Well, yeah, I try my best. As far as I'm aware, nobody has ever put as much time and effort into expressing as clearly as possible in English and as accurately as possible in English what Bhagavan has written in Tamil. There's no such thing as a perfect translation. I'm more aware than anyone else of the inadequacy of my translation, but that's not because I'm not doing the best I can, but it's because no translation can be equal to the original. But to a very great extent, we can convey in a careful, thoughtful translation can convey the essential message. Of course, my translations are in prose, so it lacks the force and the beauty of Bhagavan's Tamil, beautiful Tamil poetry. That I can't reproduce. And some people try to make poetic translations. I don't think that's a good idea, because you're then sacrificing the meaning for the sake of the form, the way it's expressed. So I think the meaning, any translation needs to focus on the meaning.
Thank you.
Right.
Shall we go to the questions that are asked under the
Yes.
announcement video on the Q&A channel? So the first question is, if the remnant neither loops nor dissolves, yet still watches, has the mirror shattered or was it never whole?
I haven't been able to work out what exactly this is asking. It's not clear to me. I don't see how the ego can be referred to as a remnant. And I don't understand what is meant by loops. What doesn't dissolve is what remains. That's the reality. So if the reality doesn't dissolve, yet still watches means the reality is pure awareness. It's not watching anything other than itself. It is aware of itself just by being itself. So it's pure being awareness, Satchit. The mirror, I suppose, means the the mind, the mind never actually existed. When we see ourselves as we actually are, that is metaphorically referred to as manonasa, the annihilation of the mind, or eradication of ego. But it is, the mind is eradicated, or the ego is eradicated by seeing that there never was any such thing at all. Like the only way to kill the snake, the seeming snake, is to look at it carefully and see that actually it's a rope. Once you see it's a rope, in effect, the snake has been killed, but actually there never was any snake there at all. But whether this is, I mean, I don't know why someone asked such a question in such a way, unless there's some context, but I don't know what context this was asked in. So it's, as I say, I'm really not. If the remnant refers to what we actually are, which alone is what remains when ego is annihilated, then of course it cannot dissolve because it is pure being. It's ever unchanging. It watches means it doesn't watch us in the sense of watching something other than itself. It just is as it is, and what it is pure awareness. So I don't know whether I've answered it at all or not.
Yeah, well, I also had a problem understanding this question. So yeah, hopefully you magically gave the answer the questioner was looking for. Yeah.
It'd
So
be easier if people are a little clearer in their questions.
yeah. Well, it was.
I mean, sometimes a metaphorical question can be clear, but this, to me, it wasn't clear at all.
Yeah. Okay, next question. Since only our real nature will be left after the realizer's death, and since that real nature will not have undergone any change ever, what will the point of the appearance of the world, within quotation marks, in ignorance have been? Why anything?
When we know ourselves as we actually are, we, as he says, what we actually are has never undergone any change. So nothing has actually ever happened. That is, when we know ourselves as we actually are, we'll know that ego never existed. Since ego never existed, there never was any world or any ignorance. So and there would be no one left to ask what is the point. Asking what is the point is is a question that can be asked only from the point of view of ego. If we investigate this ego and find no such thing has ever existed, the question about what will be the point will dissolve along with the questioner, namely ego. That is, when we know ourselves as we actually are, there's no one left to question and nothing left to question. There is only just pure being awareness, such it.
Yeah, this is I recognize this can be the kind of questions you have when you, which I had in my way, like being caught up by the Maya of trying to find clarity, but it's still ego investigating its own ignorance, which is impossible in a way.
Yeah, Bhagavan made it clear, asking why or how is the wrong question. We need to ask who or what or to whom. To whom is all this world's appearance? To whom are all these questions? So we need to turn all questioning back on ourselves.
Yeah, you could perhaps say, like, I mean, I follow this path I am aware of a world, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But just like recently, I created a Q&A video because a lot of people are disturbed about having thoughts. And then in that specific Q&A, you said, have as many thoughts as you want. They're not your enemy. They're your friends because they remind you continuously of, I'm paraphrasing, of the beingness that is present in every thought. So you could say, what is the point of the appearance of the world?
It's not what is present in the thought. That is, the thoughts appear because I am.
Yeah.
If I wasn't here, these thoughts couldn't appear. So to
Yes.
whom do all these thoughts appear?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah.
And so you could say the point of the appearance at the moment of the world is to remind you that you have to be there for a world.
Yeah.
So that,
Yeah.
I mean,
that
as long as
that we can say at the present, but this
At the
person
present,
says what will have been the point,
yeah,
which there never was any point.
yeah,
For our present purposes, the only point is to know what we actually are.
Yeah.
If we know what we actually are, then all problems are solved.
yeah. Then there was no world at all. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Next question. Michael, hi, Nicole here. I have a highly overactive mind, hence find self-attention difficult and causing anxiety. So can I try some easy practice like chanting Om Namo Bhagavate Sri Ramanaya, and once my mind becomes calm and steady through concentration on Bhagavan's name and form, then take up self-inquiry. Thanks, Michael.
We can try anything we like. There's no compulsion in Bhagavan's path. But we need to, if we have an overactive mind, the best solution is to focus on Bhagavan's teachings. Think carefully about Bhagavan's teachings. Then we will see that there's really, we will get stronger motivation to attend to ourselves. Why we find attention difficult is not because our mind is overactive. That is, our mind is overactive and we find self-attention difficult because we are interested in things other than ourselves. That is, the more interested we are in other things, the more overactive our mind will be. Likewise, the more interested we are in other things, the less inclined we will be to attend to ourselves. So we will find it difficult. So the overactive mind and the difficulty felt in being self-attentive are both caused, each individually caused, by our interest in things other than ourselves. So we need to wean our mind off its interest in other things. The best way to wean our mind off its interest in other things is by constantly reading, thinking about, and trying our best to practice what Bhagavan has taught us. It may be difficult for us to hold on to self-attention for any length of time, but at least we can try to attend to ourselves briefly, but persistently, trying again and again and again. So it's not wrong to chant Bhagavan's name, but when we chant Bhagavan's name, we're trying to fix our mind on Bhagavan. Rather than fixing our mind on his name and form, why not use that as an aid to fix our mind on his reality? His reality is that which is shining in our heart as I. So if we want to repeat Bhagavan's name, we should do it with the remembrance that that name refers to that which is ever shining within us as our own being. That is the real form of Bhagavan. That's why Bhagavan said the first name of God, the foremost name of God is I am. Because God is always shining in our heart as our own being. So most of us, we have too much interest in other things. So consequently, our minds are overactive. Consequently, we find it difficult to hold on to self-attentiveness. We can turn our attention back to ourselves, but it seems difficult to hold on to it for long because our mind keeps on coming out. But let's not give up trying and think, oh, I can do something easier. Let me just repeat Bhagavan's name or something. Because even if our mind is overactive, that's because of our interest in other things. Even if we're repeating Bhagavan's name, our mind will be thinking of other things. So we shouldn't be looking for an easy solution. We need to keep our focus on the need to be self-attentive. We need to try our best to be self-attentive. And the best support for that is constantly reading and thinking about Bhagavan's teachings. As I said earlier, when I talk about Bhagavan's teachings, primarily I'm talking about his own original writings. So the more we focus on his original writings, think about them, think about how they apply to us, think about why is our mind overactive? Why do we find self-attention difficult? It's because of our Vishaya vasanas. The Vishaya vasanas means our inclination to attend to Vishayas, things other than ourselves. We have that because of our that we have so much taste in attending to other things. So we need to wean our mind off its liking to attend to other things. And we can wean it off its liking to attend to other things only by trying to attend to ourselves. And to try to attend, to support us in our efforts to attend to ourselves, reading and thinking about Bhagavan's teachings is the best support. So I'm not saying you shouldn't repeat Bhagavan's name, but don't limit yourself just to repeating his name. Even when you repeat his name, try to remember that he's ever shining in your heart as your own being. And try to be turning your mind within even while repeating his name. That's my suggestion. But of course, we are free to do anything. Bhagavan, many people who came to Bhagavan were not at all interested in practicing Atma-vichara. They were doing some japa or dhyana or something or other. When they asked Bhagavan, Bhagavan said, yes, that's good. Because Bhagavan isn't going to force anyone to do anything that they're not inclined to do. But if we read his teachings, we will understand there's nothing more beneficial than knowing ourselves. And the means to know ourselves is to investigate ourselves, to attend to ourselves. So we need to be constantly encouraging ourselves to try more and more and more to be self-attentive. Nickel, you're not alone in this. We're all in the same boat. We all have strong Vishaya vasanas, and it's the same for everyone. We've all have to wean our mind off its taste in wean our mind off its Vishaya vasanas, its liking to attend to things other than itself, by taking more and more interest in knowing who am I. And that to the extent to which we're interested in knowing who am I, we will lose interest in other things. So that interest is a great aid to strengthening that interest is constantly reading and thinking about Bhagavan's teachings. And we can't read and think about his teachings adequately without trying also to put them into practice to the extent possible. So I hope that's a helpful answer to that question.
Can I say some things about related to this question that might be helpful? I translate highly overactive mind as extremely rajestic, if that's a correct translation. And I at moments I have them in the middle of the night. I wake up and then my mind is really extremely rajestic. And it's very, very hard at those moments to do Atma-vichara. I try to, but for me it really helps. For example, if I just look at Bhagavan's picture, which I'm starting to actively do. And then slowly the mind calms down and it gets more more sattvic.
Yes.
And then it's easier, or I listen to like an audio book of Bhagavan's teachings or whatever.
Yeah.
But I can relate to, just as you also said, that it can be very, very difficult to do Atma-vichara if the mind is very active.
Yes.
I also noticed it really helps, like what I do is simplifying my life. There is a quote that I read, I think in The Shining of My Lord of Muruganar, where to only focus on the things that are unavoidable, and then kind of leave everything else, so that your mind doesn't get agitated. And I noticed that also really, really helps. And another thing that might be helpful, which Bhagavan himself said, is like, I don't know what the diet is of this person, but the food advice that he gave, that,
Metta Sattvika Ahara.
yeah, I think I never ever thought in my life that I would transfer to a plant-based diet. And I'm doing it now for 5 years, and I actually think it actually might be helping
Oh,
in
it
my
definitely,
practice.
definitely it does help.
So, and it was exactly for the same reason, because I find it so difficult to be self-attentive. At least I can do something with my food. And that was inspired by a video that you had in January in 2020, that stimulated me to transfer to a plant-based diet, because I thought, if it's so difficult for me to practice self-attention, at least I am now willing then to adjust my diet, so that, as in that writing is said, help will be, how does Bhagavan
Yeah,
say?
help will arise from,
Help
yeah,
will arise. And I actually since then believe that food in that way can also help.
definitely, yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah.
One other point that I didn't answer here. Anything that will help to calm our mind is of course beneficial, but we shouldn't think that we have to make our mind calm and steady before we can take up self-investigation. The most effective way to calm the mind down is to attend to ourselves. So some people think you have to first calm the mind and then try to attend to yourself. If you want to calm the mind down, the most effective way is to attend to yourself. But I think yeah, I think the point you said about food is important, but another point is that's important to remember, that is the Sanskrit word ahara, which Bhagavan uses there. Etymologically, it means what is taken. So whatever is taken in is ahara. So primarily it refers to the physical food that we eat, but it also refers to what we take in through the senses. So if, for example, we are constantly reading the news or thinking of on social media or anything that will that draws our mind out more, we have to consider as rajasic or tamasic. So we shouldn't, if that's why, that's another good reason for keeping our mind dwelling on Bhagavan's teachings. The most sattvic mental food is to have the mind dwelling on Bhagavan's teachings. So though Bhagavan, the primary meaning, when Bhagavan spoke of Mita Sattvika Ahara Niyama, the primary meaning he was talking about food, but it also has an extended meaning. It's referring to what we are feeding our mind. So the more we focus our mind on Bhagavan's teachings, both reading and listening to his teachings and thinking about them, that is a very sattvic ahara, which will help us greatly in turning our attention back to ourselves.
Yeah, that's a very valuable addition to it. And I definitely also experienced that in my own life. And
Yeah, yeah,
feeding through all the senses, you
yeah,
can
yeah,
be very mindful about that.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and it does really, really affect negatively or
yeah.
positively in
Yeah,
the
yeah.
practice.
More,
Absolutely.
even more than the food. It's the food, but
Absolutely.
for the mental food is or the food we take in through the senses. That is the,
Yeah.
um,
And I think nowadays things like the iPad and the phone and online are
yeah, yeah,
great obstacles on the path
yeah.
for
It,
feeding
it,
our senses,
it's
not in the,
it's
yeah,
all about interest. That is
yeah,
why we attend to all these external things, because they're interesting for us. If we were as interested in knowing what we are as we are in knowing all these other things, we would very quickly make progress. The reason our progress is slow, or the reason we seem to be having difficulty focusing our attention on ourselves is because we're more interested. We have more liking for knowing other things than knowing ourselves.
yeah. The interesting thing, of course, is for me, simplifying my life is very, very, very important. And
Yeah,
sometimes I'm wondering, is it that I'm simplifying my life because that are conscious choices that makes walking this path easier? Or
yeah.
is it because I walk this path that automatically my, my life simplifies? But maybe
Yeah,
that's the
well,
chicken and the
yeah,
egg.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, each feeds the other.
Yeah, yeah, but there's definitely something happening
Yeah,
there.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
okay. The next question. Hello, Michael and Namaskar. Can you give us a couple of examples per Bhagavan or from your own experience of how the ego rises, stands, and flourishes? Does the ego or I thought need to be grasped or identified with to be considered rising? If an I thought enters the mind, whether or not we identify with it, is it safe to say the ego has not fully died yet? Or is it considered dead if it simply arises in pure awareness and is only watched or witnessed? Thank you.
Um, Firstly, ego and I thought are synonymous. There is no I thought other than ego. But ego and I thought are not objects, they are the subject. So, so long as we are aware of anything other than ourself, we who are aware of that, our ego, or what Bhagavan also referred to as the thought called I. That is the reason he referred to ego as the thought called I, is to emphasize it is nothing but a thought. But he made it clear, firstly, that of all thoughts, it's the first thought. And it also, it's a thought unlike other thoughts, because other thoughts are all objects. So they're all jada, they're devoid of awareness. Whereas is ego, which is the first thought, is the only thought that is endowed with awareness. So all other thoughts exist only in the view of ego. And when we talk about thoughts in the context of Bhagavan teaching, all phenomena are thoughts. Bhagavan says there's no such thing as world other than thought. Earlier I read towards I think the third last sentence in the 14th paragraph of Nana, Bhagavan says, Jagamembadu Nineve. What is called the world is only thoughts. So this whole world is nothing but thoughts. So long as we are aware of anything other than ourselves, we who are aware of that are ego, so we have already risen. We have risen and we are standing. And by attending to things other than ourselves, we as ego are flourishing. So they're not examples of ego rising, standing, and flourishing. The ego rises as soon as we begin to dream or we wake up from sleep. That is the rising of ego. Throughout the waking and dream states, ego is standing. And it is also, so long as we're attending to anything other than ourselves, who is thereby flourishing. That is, Bhagavan makes it clear, by implication in verse 25 of Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu, and sometimes he was even more explicit, that the food on which ego lives and flourishes is attention to things other than ourself. So attending to anything other than ourself is feeding and nourishing ego. So the question, does ego or I thought need to be grasped or identified with to be considered rising? That is, we don't identify with ego. Ego is that which identifies with the body. So long as we are aware of ourselves as I am this body, and are consequently aware of things other than ourselves, or a world, we have already risen as ego. So it is ego first grasps the body as I, and then it's grasping other things by attending to them. So if instead of grasping anything other than ourselves, if we try to grasp ourselves, in other words, if we try to grasp ourselves who now seem to be ego, to the extent to which we grasp ourselves, in other words, to the extent to which we attend to ourselves, our attention will be withdrawn from other things, and so we as ego will subside. The more we attend to ourselves, the more we as ego subside. And if we attend to ourselves keenly enough, we will subside completely and thereby dissolve forever into our source. Our source means that from which we have risen, namely our own being. So we need to grasp ego to the extent to which we grasp in the sense of attend to ego. To the extent to which we attend to ego, it thereby subsides. But ego is not an object we're attending to. We who are attending are the ego. So we need to attend to ourselves. And then he says, if an I thought enters the mind, I thought doesn't enter the mind. When I thought or ego rises, well, it expands as the mind. So it's not I thought entering the mind. That is, I thought is the very root of the mind. The mind is nothing but an expansion of ego, the thought called I. And he says, whether or not we identify, we don't need to identify with ego. That is, ego is what we seem to be, so long as we identify with anything other than our own being. In other words, so long as we experience ourselves as I am this body, I am this person, we are ego. So it's not that we have identified with ego. We as ego have identified ourselves as a person, as a body. So, and then he says, is it safe to say ego has not yet fully died? So long as we are aware of anything other than ourselves, anything other than ourselves as pure being awareness, ego has not died. So long as we're aware of the world, so long as we're aware of the body, so long as we're aware of anything other than that which is eternal, namely our own being, I am, ego is that which is aware of these other things. And he said, or is it considered dead if it simply arises in pure awareness? That is, it's only in pure awareness that all this arising can happen. But when we say it arises in pure awareness, that doesn't mean pure awareness is aware of this rising. For pure awareness, there is no such thing as rising. But we as ego seem to have risen. But we cannot have risen outside pure awareness, because pure awareness is the infinite whole. It's our own reality. So ego is dead when there is no rising, when we are just being as we actually are, aware of nothing other than ourselves. And then he says, or only watched or witnessed. what we are to watch or witness is ourself. That is, as ego, we are that which, we are the witness of all other things. We're that which is aware of all other things. So we need to turn our attention away from all other things, back to ourself, the one who was attending to all these things, the one in whose view all these other things seem to exist. I hope that adequately answers that question.
May I ask you something
Yes,
about
yes.
it, or say something about it, about the flourishes part? Because I've been thinking in my own manana about that.
Yeah.
And let me refer to verse, what is it again? 25 of Uḷḷadu Nāṛpadu. Grasping form, it comes into existence. Grasping form, it stands. Grasping and feeding on form, it grows abundantly or flourishes. From my own daily experience, let's take the news, which I don't look at that much. But sometimes there is like, and I'm very much aware that it's ego, like, let's see what's on the news. And I am aware, unless I nip it in the bud, if I do that and something dramatic has happened, which unfortunately happens quite a lot recently, and Sean is also there and it's like, well, have you heard now what happened? There's all kind of craziness going on in the world. I'm very much aware that at that moment it starts to flourish because I gave in to the inclination. It's not only like quickly reading it, no, it's immediately kind of wow, and then having a talk with someone else about it. So that seems for me a really, really clear experience or example of how, and how do I prevent that? Because I'm aware that is what happens, is just, it is abstination. Don't watch the news unless for some reason it really, really, you kind of really have to, or it happens accidentally somewhere else. Does that make sense?
That's perfect. That is, the more we attend to or take interest in anything other than ourselves, the more the inclination to do so increases. So that is, the more we allow our mind to go outwards, the greater the momentum, so to speak. It builds up momentum and goes out more and more and more enthusiastically. So this also applies to the previous question about an overactive mind. The mind is overactive because it's interested in things other than itself. So we need to wean our mind off interest in anything other than knowing and being what we actually are.
Yeah, and if you, for example, take the news element, which is, of course, I guess, something that a lot of people are perhaps struggling with following this path. But I'm also aware, I mean, I fall in the trap many times still, but I'm aware that I'm giving reality to something that is unreal. It's anatma, it's not self. And we can nothing do than keep on trying to do our best.
Exactly.
The following question is, Dear Michael, the question that weighs on my heart. Without love, the amount of practice does not increase, and without practice, the amount of love does not increase. Is it necessary to force oneself, go against one's inclinations, and practice daily strict discipline in the early years in order to kickstart the snowball effect of growing love?
Sometimes if we try and force things, it can be counterproductive. Rather than talking about forcing ourselves, we need to wean our mind off its outward going inclinations. We can do that by constantly dwelling on Bhagavan's teachings and trying to put them into practice. So little by little, in chapter 6, verse 25 of the Bhagavad Gita, which Bhagavan has also translated into Tamil, Krishna begins by saying, Sane Sane. Sane Sane means slowly, slowly, gradually, gradually, gently, gently. Bhagavan has translated it into Tamil in Bhagavad Gita Saram, verse 27, I think. Yeah, he translated it as Mella Mella, which has more or less the same meaning. Slowly, slowly, gently, gently, gradually, gradually. So it seems like a vicious circle. Without love, the amount of practice doesn't increase. Without practice, the amount of love doesn't increase. So that's true, but we need to go about it slowly and gently, gradually, gradually, turning our attention back to ourselves, taking more and more interest in knowing and being what we actually are, and thereby gradually weaning our mind off its outward going inclinations. We can't fight our inclinations, but we can slowly try to curb them, to stop taking interest in anything other than our own being, knowing what we actually are. Sometimes if you ask about daily strict discipline, a certain amount of discipline is good, but we shouldn't overdo it. Sometimes if you try and force things, it can have a counterproductive effect. So we need, that's why Krishna says, Sane Sane, gradually, gradually. But we need to be firm and persistent, not to force ourselves, but to gently to be gentle but firm. We shouldn't be lax in our effort to attend to ourselves. So we need to be firm in our persistence, but also need to take a gentle approach to it. To know this outward going inclination, these Vishaya vasanas, we have been cultivating for countless lives. So now we are trying to reverse the process that we have built up over so many lives. So we have to be patient. We have to go about this gently, but persistently. Persistence is all important. Bhagavan always emphasized persistence. When he was asked if there's any sign of progress on this path, he said the only sign of progress is persistence. So long as we're persisting in trying, we are going in the right direction. We are making progress. So let's be firm but gentle with ourselves. I hope that adequately answers that question.
Thank you, Michael. So a following question, please answer, Michael. I was an atheist for most of my adult life until, by the grace of God, I came upon Advaita. Suddenly I felt I understood better the role of religion generally and the conception of God in those religions. However, despite doing Atma-vichara and reading about Atma-vichara, I still do not feel like I am Brahman. I realize it takes time and practice. Now I am feeling pulled toward Tantra as a means to aid in my self-realization. Ramana has said ritual is not needed and that Atma-vichara is the most direct path, but he was not necessarily opposed to other paths for what I understand. Is it possible that in addition to Atma-vichara, tantric ritual and upasana of God with form may help me realize the self by purifying the mind, or will it most likely be a distraction hindrance? And then there was a follow-up by the comment. The relevance of me including that I was an atheist is that it seems usually you worship a personal deity and that culminates in the realization of oneness. Whereas I feel like I am starting with accepting the divine as the one ultimate reality, but now, surprisingly enough to myself, I desire to worship God with form despite being a non-dualist. Ramakrishna has said, I want to eat the sugar, not become the sugar. I feel like both. As long as I feel embodied, I want to taste the sugar and then ultimately become the sugar.
Right. Okay. Firstly, I don't think Ramakrishna, I think when Ramakrishna said, I want to eat sugar, not become sugar, he was quoting what the what a lot of the non-Advaitins say. That is, a lot of people who are following other interpretations of Vedanta, the interpretations of Vedanta that focus more on external name and form than the inner reality. They say, I want to eat sugar, not become sugar. What Bhagavan said about that is, it's, is Brahman insentient like sugar? We can taste the bliss of Brahman only by being Brahman. So it's not a question of either becoming the sugar or tasting the sugar. We can taste the sugar only by being the sugar, if we understand that the sugar is Brahman. Regarding the earlier part of the question, he said, he or she says, despite doing Atma-vichara and reading about Atma-vichara, I still do not feel like I am Brahman. We will never feel like I am Brahman. I am Brahman is merely pointing out to us what our real nature is. But as Bhagavan said, the ultimate reality, our real identity is not I am this or I am that. Our real identity is I am I. In other words, I am nothing other than I. So that I is Brahman. But we don't feel, if we identify ourselves as I am Brahman, if I is Brahman, why to use two separate words? Why not simplify it and say I am I? Because there's no Brahman other than I. So what we actually are is only I. Because if we introduce another word such as Brahman, so long as we don't know ourselves, Brahman is for us just an idea. When we do know ourselves, Brahman is nothing other than ourselves. So this label Brahman is useful at a preliminary stage to point out you're not what you take yourself to be. You're not this small person or body or anything. You are Brahman. You are the ultimate supreme reality. That doesn't mean that we will there'll ever be a thought, I am Brahman. If we are thinking I am Brahman, we don't know Brahman. There's no Brahman other than I am. All we need, the reason we are told, Tattvamasi, you are that, Aham Brahmasmi, I am Brahman, is to make us understand that what we were previously seeking outside ourselves, God or Brahman or happiness or whatever it is, that is nothing other than ourselves. So we then need to focus only on I, not on Brahman. So long as we're thinking of Brahman, so long as we experience ourselves as a body, the word Brahman suggests something other than ourselves. It may be something vast in which we are included, but we do not now experience ourselves as Brahman. So what we need to in order to know Brahman, we need to focus our attention only on I. Forget about Brahman. That's why I say the teaching that you are Tattvamasi or I am Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi, these are preliminary teachings to get us started on the path. We can then, that's why in Bhagavan's teachings, he doesn't talk much about Brahman. He focuses on who am I? Knowing ourselves, that is, the focus has to be on ourselves. That is the intention of the Mahavakya. When when the Vedas say you are that, it is in order to turn our attention away from some idea of God or Brahman or whatever it is outside ourselves, back to turn our attention back to ourselves. So all we need to do is to investigate ourselves. Regarding Tantra and all these things, all these, these claim to be means to self-realization, Tantra and like Kashmir Shaivism, these all claim to be, but they are all very outward looking. Though they say their aim is self-realization, so long as we're focusing on rituals, on nama rupa upasana, that is worship of name and form, our mind is still going outwards. The whole aim of the spiritual path, ultimately, as made clear by Bhagavan, is to turn our mind back within. All these different types of upasana, as Bhagavan explained in verses 3 to 7 of Upadesha Undiyar, these are all, if they are done without desire, but just for the love of God, these are a means to purify the mind. That's another important thing. Most rituals, most Tantra, the aim is not, that is, the people, why most people worship God, it's not because they love God as he actually is. They love God for what they can get from him or her. A lot of the Tantrikas worship God in the form of the Divine Mother. But most of these rituals and these different forms of upasana, they are kamya, not nishkamya. So the first thing that's important, it needs to be nishkamya. We shouldn't expect to gain anything from these things. We are doing it just for the love of God. If we are doing it, that's what Bhagavan says in verse 3. Kartana karkam nishkamya karmam. That is action. Nishkamya karma means action not motivated by desire, but done for the love of God. He doesn't, in the Tamil version, he just said done for God. That implies done for the love of God. In the Malayalam version of verse 3 of Upadesha Undiyar, he says Ishwara Priti and I. That means for the love of God. That's what's implied in the Tamil. So if we're doing it not for anything we can gain from God, but just for the love of God, that will purify the mind and show the way to liberation. When he says Gati Varikambikam, it will show the way to liberation, what is implied there is when the mind is purified, it is clarified. And in that clarified mind, the way to liberation will become clear. The way to liberation is not doing anything, but just being. So it's not a karma, but nishkarma, that is not just being, not doing. So he then, after saying that, in the next 4 verses, he goes on to talk about these in the order of their efficacy. So in verse 4, he says, this is certain, puja, japa, and dhyana are actions of body, speech, and mind. And in this order, each one is superior to the previous one. When he says superior, he means it's more effective in a more effective means of purifying the mind. It's more efficacious in purifying the mind, because that's the aim of all these. So more effective than puja is japa, more effective than japa is dhyana. Then he, in the next 3 verses, he devotes to each of these. In verse 5, he talks about, he says, he gives a very broad definition of worship. He says, worshipping, considering all the 8 forms to be forms of God, it's good worship of God. The 8 forms means the 5 elements, the sun, moon, and jiva. Jiva means soul. So, in other words, the whole world is nothing but God. If you worship with that attitude, that is good worship of God. So that means it need not be ritual worship. You can worship by, if you see a hungry person, you consider that hungry person to be God in that form and offer food, not with the attitude I'm superior, so I'm giving to this inferior person, but with the attitude, God has come to me in this form, I am offering it for food to God in the form of this hungry person. So if we worship like that, that is good worship of God. But more effective than that is japa. So in the next verse, he takes up japa. And then he talks about different types of japa. He says, he packs a lot into this verse, but the idea is more effective than stotras, singing in praise, hymns of praise, is japa. More effective than japa done aloud is japa whispered softly within the mouth. More effective than japa whispered softly in the mouth is mental japa. That is a form of dhyana. And then in the verse 7, that's verse 6, in verse 7, he then talks about dhyana. And he says, rather than dhyana that's interrupted, meaning interrupted by other thoughts, dhyana that is uninterrupted, like the flow of a river or pouring ghee, that is best. The reason he says that is, if we are meditating on God, and our meditation is often interrupted by other thoughts, that means we are more interested in those other, whatever we're thinking of, than we are in thinking of God. So if we have real love for God, our mind will be able to fix our mind unwaveringly on God without thinking of anything else. If we think of other things, that means we're more interested in those other things than we are in thinking about God. So these are all karmas. These are all, as he says, actions of body, speech, and mind. So up to this stage, it's all nishkarmiya karma. But Bhagavan doesn't take nishkarmiya karma to be a separate path. It is the preliminary stages of the path of bhakti. The more advanced stages of the path of bhakti, he points out in verse 8 and 9. What he says in verse 8 is, rather than anya bhava, ananya bhava, in which he is I, is best among all. What he means by anya bhava is, anya means what is other. And bhava in this context means meditation. So anya bhava is meditation on what is other. In the context it implies meditation on God as something other than ourselves. So if we're worshipping God in name or form, we are worshipping God as something other than ourselves. Rather than that, ananya bhava, that is, ananya means what is not other. So ananya bhava means meditation on what is not other. That implies meditation on God as nothing other than oneself. And he makes that clear by saying, avanahamaham, in which he is I. So in that ananya bhava, in which we understand that God is that which is shining within us as I, that is anatam uttamam. That is the best among all. That means that's the best among all the means to purify the mind. So all these other, this puja, japa, and dhyana, if they're done with love for God, without any seeking the fulfillment of any desires, that will purify the mind. When the mind is purified sufficiently, it will be clear that God cannot be something other than ourself. God is the reality of ourself. He's that which is shining within us as I. So then we will switch our attention from external form of God to the reality of God, which is shining within our heart as I. So we'll meditate on nothing other than I. So Ananya Bhava means is another way of describing self-investigation, Atma-vichara. That is meditating on nothing other than I. So that's verse 8, which he said, and he said that is the best among all. That means it's the most, among all the means to purify the mind, it's the most effective. It's also the best among all forms of meditation, the best among all forms of spiritual practice. So he talks about these other paths, showing how they will eventually lead to Atma-vichara. But leading to Atma-vichara is the aim. But where will Atma-vichara take us? That he describes in the next verse, verse 9. He begins by saying, Bhava Balatinal, by the strength of meditation. What meditation? By implication, the strength of the Ananya Bhava, by the strength of the self-attentiveness, is what is implied there. Bhavanatita Satbhavatu Iritale, being in Satbhava. Satbhava means the state of being, our real state, if it's a state just being as we actually are, which is Bhavanatita, which transcends. Bhavana there implies meditation in the form of mental activity. That is, if we're meditating on anything other than ourselves, that is a mental activity. If we're meditating on ourself alone, that is a cessation of mental activity, because to the extent to which we attend to ourselves, we subside, and when we subside, our mental activity subsides along with us. So when he says bhavanatita, he means it transcends all meditation in the form of mental activity, that meditation on anything other than oneself. So being in Satbhava is Parabhakti Tattva. That is the very nature of supreme devotion. So the path of bhakti begins with nishkarmiya karma in the form of puja, japa, and dhyana. And it eventually leads to Atma-vichara, which is the best among all. And as a result of Atma-vichara, we remain in our state of being, and that is the supreme devotion. So, having come to Bhagavan, we've been given the greatest treasure of all, which is this path of Atma-vichara. I mean, we're each free to do whatever we want. If our heart draws us to the path of Tantra or Upasana of Namarupa Upasana, so be it. But we shouldn't neglect the great treasure we have found. We have come to Bhagavan's teachings. We've understood something about Bhagavan's teaching. This is the greatest treasure of all. So whatever other practices we may be drawn to do, we shouldn't if we are wise, we won't completely neglect Atma-vichara. We'll make Atma-vichara as our central practice and all these other things as subsidiary practices. Otherwise, we are... Well, I mean, of course, we're all free to do whatever we want. But we want what is best for us, and what is best of all is Atma-vichara, as Bhagavan makes very, very clear in verse 8 of Upadesha. And then he asks, will it most likely be a distraction or hindrance? Yes, if we've come to this path of Atma-vichara and then we revert to Nama-rupa Upasana, that is distracting us away from this central, all-important path of Atma-vichara. So yes, it can be a distraction, a hindrance. Also, we need to understand our motivation. What is it that draws us to tantric ritual or Nama-rupa Upasana? Is it just for the love of God, or are we seeking something from God? Most of the most people who follow the path of Tantra, most are seeking to gain something from God. Most who engage in Namarupasana are seeking to gain something from God. If we are seeking to gain something from God, we haven't even yet come to the real path of bhakti, because real bhakti begins with nishkamya bhakti. So long as we're worshipping God because it's something we think we can gain from God, that's not true love of God. That is love of what we can gain from God. That is, God is a means, not the end. So only if God is our sole end can we truly be said to be following the path of bhakti. Otherwise, it's just, well, we haven't even yet come to the real path of bhakti. Real path of bhakti begins with being nishkamya. Kamya bhakti is not real bhakti. It's bhakti for what we can get from God rather than for God himself. So if we are drawn to kamya upasana, or kamya, if we're doing the rituals with the tantric rituals with a kamya motive, then that is definitely a hindrance and a distraction. If we're doing it with true love, yes, it can help to purify the mind, and it will gradually lead us. By purifying mind, it'll give us the clarity to recognize that God is not something other than ourselves, but we can know God as he or she actually is only by turning our attention within, attending to him or her shining ever in our heart. So I hope that's an adequate answer to that question.
Thank you, Mike.
Do you have
Thank you,
anything
Mike.
else you want to ask on that?
I don't want to,
No.
I don't have any questions about that. Do you, Sean?
In Talk 50, Bhagavan quotes Kabir as saying, "All know that the drop merges into the ocean, but few know that the ocean merges into the drop." And then Bhagavan commented, "This is Parabhakti."
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, it's ultimately, I mean, Bhagavan also talks about merging, but Bhagavan also made it clear we talk about merging metaphorically, because ultimately there's no merging, because we are already that. And that is already what we actually are. So whether you say we merge in that, whether you say the river merges in the ocean or the ocean merges in the river, I mean, the two become one. But even in this case, all analogies have their limitations, because in this path, it's not even a matter of becoming God. It's a matter of being God, which is what we always actually are. Even when we rise as ego, we are never anything other than God. But we don't experience ourselves as such because we now mistake ourselves to be a body. So when ego is annihilated, this false identification I am this body goes, and what remains is what we always actually are. So it's very difficult from passages in talks. Firstly, we don't know exactly what Bhagavan said. Something would have been said to Bhagavan, he would have replied in Tamil, and so how accurately it's been translated, and the full context, exactly what was meant, is not very clear. So I'm always, I don't like to draw conclusions from things that I'm not sure are what Bhagavan actually said and meant.
That sounds fine. I have a quick comment that a friend just emailed to me that if you wouldn't mind discussing briefly. He said, "I do struggle with the coherence of Advaita Vedanta to make sense of the idea that there's only one thing. It seems so evident that your experiences are different to my experiences."
In the experience of each one of us, there is one experiencer. We see, as the experiencer, namely ego, we experience ourselves as I am this body. Because we identify ourselves as this body, we identify every other body as an ego like us. So it seems to us that there are many experiences. But all we can ever be sure of is that there's one experiencer. In a dream, so long as we're dreaming, there seem to be many experiencers. So many other people, we talk to them and we say, do you see that? Yes, I see it. So it seems to us that we live in a world in which there are many experiencers and all are experiencing the same thing from different points of view. But when we wake up from a dream, we know the whole thing, including all the other people, were only in our view. So when such is the case with dream, so long as we're dreaming, it all seems so real. So we can't be sure, even in this waking state, that there's ever any experiencer other than ourselves. So let's start with what we can be sure of. We are sure we are there as an experiencer. Of course, when we're interacting with the external world, we act according to the appearance. And the appearances, there are many others like us. But when we consider the matter deeply, think about it deeply, we can never be sure that there's any experiencer other than ourselves. So let's begin from what we can be sure of. So we have one experiencer, and many things are experienced. Can we be sure that any of the things that are experienced have any existence independent of the experiencer's experience of them? In other words, can we be sure that anything we perceive exists independent of our perception of it? No, obviously we can't. The only reason we believe there's a world full of so many people is because we perceive it, because we experience it. So we have no evidence that anything other than ourselves exists. We seem to be, so long as we're experiencing this world, we seem to be a person in this world. But even this we have to doubt. Though we seem to be this person, is this what we actually are? The only thing we can actually be sure of is our own existence and awareness, our own being and awareness. That is, we know I am, and we know I am aware. Everything else could be just an appearance, an illusory appearance. We have no evidence that anything other than ourself is real. So if we consider this, we come back to the only thing that we're sure about is ourself. That's not ourself as this person that we seem to be, but as the awareness that we actually are. We are aware of other things only so long as we mistake ourselves to be this person, a body, in other words. So long as we mistake ourselves to be a body, we are aware of a world and all these other things. So if we are doubting whether we are actually this body that we seem to be, then everything is in doubt. So the only thing that we can be sure of is our own being. Our own being as awareness. We are aware of, we exist as that which is aware. That the irreducible data of our experience is I am. Everything else we can doubt the reality of. We cannot doubt the reality of our own being and our own awareness. So everything else is in doubt. Let us investigate first that which is certain, namely ourselves. Now we mistake ourselves to be this body, but this cannot be what we actually are, because we are aware of this body only in one of our three states of experience. In dream, we're not aware of this body, we're aware of some other body that seems to be the same body, so long as we're dreaming. But when we wake up, we realize it wasn't the same body. It was because this body was lying on a bed, supposedly, and that body was wandering around in the world doing all sorts of things. So since we experienced ourselves in dream without experiencing this body cannot be what we actually are. Since we experienced ourselves now without experiencing that body cannot be what we actually are. So what are we? In both states, we're aware of this mind. But this mind appears only in waking and dream. In sleep, the mind disappears, but we remain. And we not only do we exist in sleep, but we also are aware of our existence. We're aware of our being. That is why when we wake up, we recognize I slept. So it's not a state of non-existence or non-awareness. We are not aware of anything other than ourselves. So what we actually are is only that being awareness. So our present experience of ourselves as this body is an illusory experience. Let's first find out what we actually are. Let us do research. Let us investigate what we are absolutely sure of, namely our own being, to find out what we actually are. When we find out what we actually are, then let us see whether anything else exists. We can never be, though we experience multiplicity, we can never be sure that this multiplicity is anything more than a dream. We experience the same multiplicity in dream. Is there anything we experience in the waking state, or is there ever anything we experience in the waking state that could prove this is not a dream? No. Whatever we experience in this state, we could also experience in a dream. So we have no evidence that we are not now dreaming. It seems to us, no, I'm awake. There's other people will corroborate it. In dream also other people will corroborate our experience. So that's no evidence that this is anything other than a dream. So let's first investigate and know that which we're absolutely sure of. Then we can decide about all other things.
Thank you. I'll tell them what you said.
Yeah.
I can remember listening to an audio of one of your meetings, really like 5-6 years ago, Michael, where you said something paraphrased like, even if someone is interested in this path of Bhagavan, but that person cannot accept that the waking state is like a dream, then they won't get deeper in the understanding. Is it correct if I remember it like that?
I can't remember what I said, but yes.
No, I know, but
I think it's quite important that we understand. Yeah. Another thing that a lot of people have difficulty understanding is awareness in sleep. Many people have difficulty grasping that. We can give arguments to explain that, but even then, not everyone is able to catch the point. What I always say to such people is then the only way you'll find out, practice Atma-vichara more and more. By practicing Atma-vichara more and more, you will become familiar with your existence independent of all these phenomena. Or not independent of, as something distinct from all these phenomena. Then it will become clearer that our being continues to shine in sleep. Shine is the operative word. Shine means it's known. We as pure being know ourself as pure being in sleep. Now it's again covered over by our rising as ego and identifying ourselves with this body. So our recollection of sleep is clouded, is obscured by our present false identification, I am this body. But in sleep, there was no such identification. There was only Satchit, pure being awareness. If we can grasp these things, it helps us a lot. If people have difficulty grasping them, it doesn't mean they shouldn't try to practice Atma-vichara, because practicing Atma-vichara is the best way to understand these things. But it helps a lot if we're able to understand that this waking state is no different to a dream. There's nothing in this waking state that we have no evidence that this present state is anything other than a dream. And we have very clear evidence of our own experience, but we continue to exist as awareness in sleep, as pure awareness, pure being awareness. To the extent to which we can grasp these things, it helps a lot in this practice.
Yeah, true.
Not being able to grasp these doesn't mean it's an insurmountable obstacle, but it just helps a lot to the extent that we can grasp these things.
Yeah. Well, I always think in the end, Bhagavan's grace, if you walk it, Bhagavan's grace will show itself and then the clarity arises.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm very much aware of that. If I look at my path, seemingly path, that it's not, I mean, it seems like I'm doing something, but I'm very, very much aware of that in the end, was all Bhagavan's grace that made me interested in him. And well, eventually,
the effort we make in following this path, in turning our attention within, is grace working through us.
Yeah. No, but also Bhagavan making himself known to me. All those things. Yeah. I had a last question. At least someone asked that under a post on the Q&A channel, and I thought it was a very beautiful question to ask here, which is, please, could you explain the phenomenon of Arunachala? Bhagavan stated on many occasions that Arunachala is Shiva himself, and that everyone who mentally remembers Arunachala will attain self-realization. How can this be?
Right. Okay. This question will be answered most fully in a series of articles that I will be posting on my blog hopefully in the next month or so. That is, I recently posted a translation of Arunachala Ashtakam on my blog. It can be accessed through my website. On the translation page, there's a link to it. I have also begun to write a detailed explanation of each verse. Bhagavan, that is, the explanation, particularly for the first 5 verses or so, this Bhagavan deals with this topic in great detail. That is, as he makes clear there, what Arunachala actually is the ultimate reality that is shining in our heart as our own being. But it has appeared outwardly in the external form of Arunachala in order to turn our mind within. How this works, this is the subtle working of grace. It cannot be adequately explained, but it can be understood to some extent. For example, in verse 10 of Arunachala Patikam, Bhagavan explains what happens when we think of Arunachala even once. He says, I have seen a wonder, this magnetic hill that forcibly attracts the soul. And then he goes, that's the first sentence. In the second sentence, he says, subduing the activity, implying that outward going mental activity of the soul who thinks of it even once, drawing it within to face, well, he doesn't say, he says, drawing it to face towards itself, the one, that implies to face within, Because if it's for one, it can't be one thing attending to another thing. So when he said to face itself for one, Oru Tanadu Abhimukamaha, that one must be ourself, because Arunachala cannot be other than ourself. So drawing it within to face towards itself, making it motionless like itself, it feeds upon that sweet soul. No, it takes that sweet soul as bali. Bali means what the food that is offered in sacrifice. So taking as bali implies it consumes the soul. So there Bhagavan is giving us, pointing out how Arunachala works from within by making us think of its external form that has some effect that we cannot adequately understand with our mind, but it works from within to subdue the cheshte. Cheshte means the activity, particularly mischievous activity. It implies the outward going activity of the mind. It draws the mind within to face towards itself, thereby it makes it motionless like itself, and then it takes that sweet soul as bali. When he says sweet soul, that innuir, in means sweet, it implies it has become mature, it has ripened by that process of working of grace, and it feeds upon that soul. And then he ends that verse by saying, or tuminnuir kal ulamadilloririv if we koli arunamagiriye, souls be saved, thinking of this great Arunagiri, the killer of the soul, who shines within the heart. So though that is that external form is there to turn us back to the true form of Arunachala, which is shining in our heart. As I say, I will explain this in more detail in the series of articles. I'm going to write one article explaining each of the 8 verses. So there'll be a series of 8 articles. I'm also going to be talking about these in the next, well, in the most recent, the first meeting this month with that was just last weekend, if I remember correctly, with the Ramana Maharshi Foundation in London. I talked about the first verse. Next week I'll be talking about the second verse, and likewise for the remaining 6 will be in October, November, December. So I'll be talking about these, and also I'll write a series of articles. In these, I'll explain in much more detail the answer to this question. So I think that's all. I mean, there's a lot I could say now, but it would. I think that's sufficient for the time being. But we shouldn't think that is Bhagavan is explained in a way, but we can understand to some extent. But this is the working of grace, and how grace works, our mind can never adequately understand, because grace is the supreme power and the subtlest of all powers. So how it works, and it's working from within our own heart, deep within our heart. So the more we look within, the more we'll never fully understand the working of grace, but we'll get a clearer and clearer. It will become clearer and clearer to us how grace is working, but we will know grace fully only when it swallows us. And then it'll be clear grace has never done anything, it just is as it is. But just by being as it is, it does everything. Grace is our own real nature. Grace is what is shining in our heart as eye. Grace is Arunachala, grace is Bhagavan, grace is God. Grace is Brahman, whatever we want to call it. Rama, Krishna, Shiva, Shakti, Muruga, Jesus, Buddha, anything, whatever name, or Allah, whatever name you want to call it, it's all only grace. which is that infinite love that the one infinite reality has for us as itself. That is Bhagavan. That is Arunachala.
Living in our heart as I am.
Exactly.
Yep.
So we have to lose ourselves in that. By losing ourselves, we find ourselves.
Thank you, Michael. Sean, did you have another question?
I had a couple other questions, but I think that's a really nice place to stop. So I'll just throw them on to RMFUK or ask them some other time.
Okay. Incidentally, that email you sent me about, what's it called? Kenosis or henosis or?
Henosis.
Henosis, okay. You ended by saying henosis is the how did you say, the destruction of the annihilation of self. Theosis is the perfection of self, and moksha is the realization of self.
According to ChatGPT type stuff, yeah.
I don't think ChatGPT knows what it's talking about. That is to say, all Hindus think that moksha is to attain self-realization, to know oneself as Brahman, is not correct. That is Advaitins. The vast majority of Hindus have other conceptions of moksha. That is, for example, if you're many of the Vaishnava interpretations of Vedanta, moksha means going to Vaikuntha or Goloka, and living with Vishnu or Shiva or Krishna or whatever. That's their conception. That is the basic definition of moksha. It is release from samsara. They take this world to be samsara. But if you go to some other heavenly world, that's no longer samsara. That's their idea. So there are many, that is, Hinduism is not a single religion. It is a family of very, very diverse beliefs and practices and aims and aspirations. So it's only in Advaita that but knowing ourselves as Brahman is the aim. But Bhagavan was even more clear about that. Brahman is what we always actually are. Knowing ourselves as Brahman means just knowing ourselves as we actually are. We can know ourselves as we actually are only by the annihilation of ego. So annihilation of oneself is a more accurate description of moksha as defined by Bhagavan. That's how he defines it in the last verse of Uڵḷadu Nāṛpadu. If it is said the moksha one can attain, or mukti one can attain, is of three kinds: with form, without form, or without form. That is, there are three. There are many, many different conceptions people have of moksha. In some of them, you retain a form. Like if you're in Kailasa or Vaikuntha or some divine world with your beloved God, you remain there as a separate individual. So you retain a form. Some of them, like in Advaita, you lose your form completely because you lose yourself completely. Some have an idea of moksha. You can be formless or you can have form. You can switch between at will. So when you want, you can take a form, and when you want, you can remain formless. So many different diverse ideas people have about moksha. So Bhagavan said, if it is said that the moksha is of three kinds, with form, without form, or without form, I will say the destruction of the ego form that distinguishes liberation with form, without form, or without form is liberation. So according to Bhagavan, annihilation of ego alone is liberation, because the ego itself is samsara. So long as ego remains, it is samsara. Even if you're in the highest heaven, it's still samsara, because you're still embodied. Samsara is embodied existence. So it's not liberation, only annihilation of ego. And annihilation of ego and knowing ourselves as we actually are one and the same thing. So this idea of this henosis is much closer to the teachings of Advaita than the idea of theosis, which is more akin to other interpretations of Vedanta, where you're perfected and you therefore live in a divine world. And there are different types of, in those, there are different types. There's Salokya, where you're in the same world as God. That's one grade of liberation. Above that, there's a higher grade called Samipya, where you're very close to God. So you're not only living in the same world, but you're living very close to where God is living. That's called Samipya. Even higher grade than that is Sarupya, where you actually are given the form of God. So if you go to Vaikuntha, you'll find many Vishnus walking around, because most of the Vishnus will be people who have attained Sarupya Mukti. And then the highest of all is Saryuja, where you actually join with God, become one with God. So there's so many different ideas of moksha. ChatGPT needs to go back to school. Study a bit more about the infinite, well, not quite infinite, but the immense diversity of Hindu beliefs and practices and philosophies. And
so it sounds like moksha is identical to nirvana in Buddhism, and at least similar, if not identical, to henosis and Neoplatonism.
Yes. But even nirvana, different, even some Buddhists, they're the Pure Land Buddhists, who are very much like a lot of these Vedantins who believe that the ultimate goal is to go to heaven. Pure Land Buddhism, I think it's a Chinese or Japanese form of Buddhism. So even what is the state of nirvana, very different. That is, the word nirvana is used equally, and it's a term that predates Buddhism. It's generally considered to be a synonym for moksha, but nirvana means to be extinguished, like a candle being blown out. So nirvana essentially means annihilation of ego, but not everyone will understand it in that way. People have different interpretations.
Well, if you're still in the mood to talk, I could ask you my two other quick questions.
Okay, ask.
Okay. So there was a conversation that came up with Marty and some other people, Ted, I don't know, on San Diego group about talks, and we all know your opinion about talks. And so, but anyway, because of it, I looked back at an article I read from David Godman, and on there is a picture of one of the dialogues that was never printed. And I thought that was interesting because there's aspects of it that were never printed. So this one I thought was interesting, the one that he gave a picture of. Someone was saying that a visitor said, you know, to an inquirer, are there different religions? Inquire. And then, but then Bhagavan said, that is too advanced. So I thought that was interesting that he said that when someone else told the inquirer, are there really different religions? Inquire. And Bhagavan said, that is too advanced. But then someone else says, there is quarrel because there are so many religions and creeds. And Sri Bhagavan said, will there be no quarrel if only one religion prevails? Laughter in the hall.
Yeah.
I thought that was nice. Are there more? I know that you don't put too much credence into these things, pinch of salt, as you say, but are there more of these that are available? Or
I don't know, but that's an interesting one.
Yeah.
When Bhagavan said that's too advanced, I think the reason he would have said that, if he did say that, is different teachings are appropriate to give to different people at different times. Like it's also recorded in talks when Yogananda asked Bhagavan, what teaching should be given for the uplift of the masses? Bhagavan said, teachings cannot be given en masse. Teaching should be according to the taught. And we can see that clearly in books like Talks. Bhagavan gives different types of answers to people according to their individual needs. That's another reason why I say Talks is not a good guide to what Bhagavan's teachings are, because Bhagavan is answering questions from many different types of people. He gives different things that are appropriate to those individuals. But if we want what his core teachings are, what he came to this world to teach us, he didn't come to teach us that to teach us about Nama Japa or anything. That's everyone teaches about that. He came to teach us this path of Atma-vichara. So the real essence of Bhagavan's teachings we can get only from his own original writings. Or not only, primarily from his original writings.
Very good. And then it's okay if you don't want to talk about this now. I can bring it up later because it's kind of a sour note. There's a video was posted by Samaniri Jayasara, a reading of Aham's Purana. And apparently, like I've known for years that the ashram has disapproved of that book, that you and David Godman have disapproved of that book, but apparently it hasn't reached the broader public. So I was wondering if you'd like to make a public statement about Aham's Purana.
Well, it is almost the original that appeared in Amazon was a PDF book of more than 1,500 pages. There's a huge amount in it that is clearly a complete fabrication. Bhagavan talking in German, Bhagavan mimicking Hitler, all sorts of things that are just not at all, they just cannot have happened. There are other portions that seem very, if you take them out of the context of all the other rubbish, there's some portions that seem very plausible, seem as if they could be conversations that took place. But that doesn't mean they are conversations that took place. There's absolutely no evidence that any of that is authentic. And when some friends in the ashram, because there's references to things that are in the ashram archives, for example, Mrs. Pigot's diary. He quotes quite extensively from Mrs. Pigot's diary, but Mrs. Pigot's, there's a copy of the original Mrs. Pigot's diary is available in the ashram archives, and it doesn't tally at all. So there's clear evidence it's fabrication. I mean, we can't prove that every part is fabricated, but when probably you can find evidence that at least that a high percentage of it is fabricated, there's no reason for anyone to suppose that any of it is valid. It's a very strange book because some of it is a very clever fabrication. For example, when it was, someone sent me a copy, someone who bought a copy on Amazon sent me a copy of it and asked me, and he referred to certain pages for me to see. When I read it, I was a little bit impressed at first. Oh, this looks like it could be. And I even found a portion where Bhagavan says something which is almost exactly like a verse in Guru Vachaka Kavai. Except it's the verse in Guru Vachaka Kavai is a verse. There it's in a slightly more expanded version. So it looks as if that could have been what Murugan recorded in that Guru Vachaka Kavai verse. So I thought, oh, maybe this is genuine at first. But then I started noticing these other bits which are clearly fabrications. And then I was in correspondence with David and with some friends in the ashram, and some friends in the ashram were checking up things in the archives, and they found abundant evidence that that even the more plausible bits are fabricated.
What is the name of the man who published it again?
John David.
Oh yeah, he's
not the original. The
Oh, I
original
wrote it.
person who published it on Amazon. He's someone in Chennai, but he was using a German name, Blutkheim, which means blood something. It's very, very strange. And his behavior was very strange. At a certain time, he wanted David to write a foreword to it. And when David refused, he put some videos on YouTube saying he's burning all the notebooks because the ashram doesn't believe him and David doesn't believe him, and nobody believes him, so he's going to burn them all. And later he said that wasn't true. He just put those videos there. Those weren't really those notebooks. So the whole behavior was very, very strange. But John David got in touch with him, and he agreed to allow John David to publish an edited version. So John David, I think he asked David to write forward. David refused. He wrote to me. He didn't directly ask me to write a foreword, but he sent a sort of feeler. He wanted to get my approval for it. By that time, I was fully convinced that it's a fabrication, and I told him there's so much evidence it's a fabrication. I strongly advise you don't publish this. This would be a great disservice to Bhagavan devotees if you give authenticity to this. And he said, "Oh, but I think my gut feeling is that it's real. I had that feeling." So just on basis of his feeling, ignoring, because he must have seen all those other bits, which are clearly fabrications. So he can't really believe that's real. So I think he did a great disservice by publishing that.
Yeah, I found a video of him in conversation, and this is a quote, a direct quote. He says, "There's no historical proof, if you like, that the material is authentic." So, I mean, there's the fact of the matter. But then, as you say, he felt he was moved to do it, an instrument to publish and these sorts of things. But that's your point, and he acknowledges there's no historical proof, if you like, that the material is authentic.
But he published it as if it's authentic.
Exactly. If you look on Amazon, the author is Ramana Maharshi.
Yeah, yeah.
Another interesting thing is, at least the last time I looked, which wasn't so long ago, all of the comments are positive. Not one person said, "You know that," or at least unless it was somehow removed by Google or whatever. But there was not one negative comment that said, "You know that book is not legitimate." They're just all, "Oh, this was great."
Yeah. This is what happens. This is the nature of the world. It makes us wonder about the records of Buddha's teachings, Jesus's teachings, because they didn't write anything. It's what people decided they liked, and they published it, and who knows?
And
we are very fortunate that Bhagavan wrote his own teachings. So we don't have to rely on any record written by anyone else. Bhagavan himself has written in Tamil poetry that no one can change. Well, they could change, but I mean, it would be it would be detective if anyone were to change any of Bhagavan's verses. So it's there for all posterity. So we are very, very fortunate.
is it possible that he knew any German, or is that just completely out of the question?
Well, there's someone who says that some Kashmiri person who came to visit the ashram along with his Kashmiri servant, and his servant knew no language other than Kashmiri, and remembered Bhagavan talking to him in Kashmiri. Who knows? People say things, whether that, I mean, for Bhagavan, nothing is impossible, but it's the whole thing. If you just read, I mean, there are portions of that original PDF that are just so obviously complete fantasy. I mean, there's no relation to Bhagavan at all.
A long time ago, there was a rumor going around. I think the only criticism I ever found of Ramana, like this is going like 15 years ago or something, was that I think it was Chadwick had recorded that Bhagavan said that Hitler might be or was a jnani.
I think that was, again, it was Chadwick, Chadwick, many things, people translated things for Chadwick according to their own whims. I don't think Bhagavan would ever have said that. Bhagavan didn't say anyone is a jnani or an ajnani. Bhagavan said jnana alone is a jnani. It's not a person who is a jnani. So it's totally inconsistent with Bhagavan's teaching, apart from the fact it's obvious that Hitler was a demonic being. So, yeah, people say all sorts of things, but
well, that's all the questions I had. Thank you so much.
It's just like most people believe Hitler was well, it's not just like, but another thing, similar type of thing. Most people believe Hitler was a vegetarian. His favorite dish was liver. Some particular type of liver dish was his favorite. He wasn't vegetarian at all, but the majority of people believe Hitler was a vegetarian.
When I first went vegetarian ages ago, that was one of the nice comments I got from a friend's father. You know, who was a famous vegetarian? Hitler.
Yes, which is totally untrue. But so people believe whatever they want to believe.
Okay, I'll ask the last question.
Yeah.
Sandra and I struggle with sattvic food in limited quantities. We're really good at sattvic because we're, mostly 99% vegan. Every once in a while we end up with a little bit of cheese or something, but which I think is anyway. And so so we struggle with the in moderation portion. Do you have any advice?
Follow Bhagavan's advice, moderation. We are all immoderate. We all allow our mind to go outwards far too much. So it's just one of the many manifestations of immoderation. So the more we curb the outward going tendency of the mind, the more we will thereby curb the inclination to consume more than what is necessary.
Thank you, Michael.
Right. Namo Ramanaya.
Namo Ramanaya. Yeah, and I personally want to thank you. I feel so very grateful for you offering about, 2 years ago, for doing these 8 videos about the 8 key points. And it has been very, very helpful for me, besides watching all the other videos that you have available. But there's like a different layer in this. So that has been very helpful. It's a real treasure. So thank you for that.
Oh, well, thank you. Namo Ramanaya.